All right, I think we'll get started here as people roll in. So my name's Heather Bicknell. I'm Lakeside's Product Marketing Manager. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Cost-Effective WVD Planning, Migration, and Monitoring. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker. So we have Ben Murphy, Lakeside Senior Director of Product Management. Ben, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Heather. And thank you everyone for joining today. We will go through some of our suggestions for how to manage planning and delivering on a cost-effective Windows Virtual Desktop solution. So through this, we'll touch on a couple of points that are particularly relevant to trying to undertake that kind of a project. We'll go through our perspective on some of the key aspects of understanding what is present in an environment and how to accommodate some user needs. We'll go through what are some of the common questions that we've seen and how those questions can get answered through the use of our software. And we'll walk through what, in my opinion, is one of the more important pieces, especially in light of the fact that we have a lot of folks that have joined us that are at some point either in a POC or evaluation phase. So how do I measure the success of my implementation? It's a fairly important question, and it's one of those things that maintains its importance throughout the lifespan of your deployment. To get started, though, we'll begin with what I consider to be a starting point, which is usually a good place to start, but understanding what it is that you've got in your environment. So I think that Windows Virtual Desktop has ushered in an era where desktop as a service has, finally come into its own. We see large vendors kind of coming up with their own implementations of different management planes and things on top of it. It's a great validation from Microsoft that this is something that people want. But before you can fill your boots with trying to figure out what it is that you want to send into an Azure hosted platform, we first have to understand, what do people use? How do they use it? Where do they use it? What kind of performance characteristics do they get? And all of these kind of complex pieces of information that fit together to make the digital environment that these users exist in. So to do that, and of course, this is where we're going to introduce our component for doing it, Systrack. We have an agent that sits out on every device that a user interacts with to collect information about how they're active. Well, if you think about the genesis of a lot of these Windows Virtual Desktop projects, they fall into a couple of camps. There are some people who might have an existing VDI practice. There are some people who may already have an existing desktop as a service authoring as part of what they have available to their internal users. Doesn't really matter what the current state of things happens to be, but it is very important to understand specifically in your case how you can measure all of those different types of interactions and SaaS apps and different things and make sense out of how they function and how you can migrate them from one solution set to another. So Gartner throws around the terminology, the privileged vantage point. That's kind of the point of intersection where all of the interesting things that a user does kind of come together. And to us, that's the endpoint. So point of clarification, the endpoint to us is a Windows device or a Mac OS device or a Linux device or a thin client device, Android, Chrome OS, soon to be iOS. It's a variety of things that someone might choose to use to consume resources that they're given. But regardless of what it is, it's important to understand, how does it work? How does the user use it? And all of those details are best gotten on the device itself. And we'll talk about that when we get into some of the mechanics of the assessing of performance. But the other piece of this is, well, that's all well and good. How do I make some sense out of what I've collected? This is where the other pieces come in. So we have an Azure hosted cloud platform. There's also an on-premises solution for this as well that centralizes that data, analyzes it, and then we can output it in a variety of ways. So we've got reports. In fact, specifically, there is one that is focused on Windows Virtual Desktop We'll also take a look at some ROI analysis for certain VM costings and things like that. But all of those are basically practical uses of the data that we collect from the endpoints themselves. Well, the prospect of undertaking a project like this can either seem very simple, meaning you want to start off with maybe a clean image or kind of a basic POC with, let's say, maybe the marketplace base image for a Windows 10 multi-session Windows Virtual Desktop instance, and that's great. But once you start getting into the specific use cases that are really applicable within your environment, I think rapidly people have a tendency to find that they're missing bits and pieces of what they would expect to be present for productivity. So in our kind of methodology, we normally suggest that you continuously have some state of assessment working. So what I mean by that is some element that's collecting data about the types of users that you've got, what common characteristics they engage in or have. So things like mobile usage or certain application sets or resource consumption, backend dependencies, all of these things that are in and of themselves kind of minute little pieces of how an individual goes about their day, but in the aggregate make for a very complex and heterogeneous environment that can be challenging to port over. So the net of this is that for a successful project to start, really, I think our take is identification of use cases, meaning being able to understand, diagnose, categorize, and really figure out what solution is appropriate for your users is one of the best ways of making sure that you can actually follow through and succeed with whatever your initial goals are. So all of this stuff kind of helps you crystallize how you can deliver a better IT experience to the individuals in your org. So this introduces us, though, to where we have a tendency to run into some common questions about what is it that we have in the environment that we can port from point A to point B and the practical pieces of how that can be moved. So one thing that I do want to address up front, because it's something that has come up as a common question, which is lift and shift. So some individuals may be familiar with the approach for, let's say, an Azure Migrate or Azure Site Recovery based migration of non-end user workloads. That would not apply to this case. So for a variety of reasons, and we'll point some things out, it would be pretty difficult to do that. Hence, our kind of interest in understanding the use cases, being able to articulate what it is that we even want to take with us into kind of the future, so to speak, and then how you can make sure that it does what you want it to. So we roughly categorize that into some groupings, and the first part is deceptively complicated for how simple the questions seem to be. So as an example, we have a tendency to have a lot of interest in, as an example, understanding the state of performance and utilization for maybe some legacy operating systems like Windows 7. That is a large part of the value proposition that we have in place because, one, with Windows Virtual Desktop, you have the ability to maintain continuity of support, meaning you don't have to pay for extended support if you're using a remote session host that uses Windows 7 and Windows Virtual Desktop. So it's an interesting opportunity. However, there's a much more important and fundamental question, which is, do I want to do that? And that's kind of the overarching point of kind of our presentation and kind of the overall idea, which is making sure that, sure, we can answer some basic questions. Do I have Windows 7 in usage in the environment? But we want to introduce some more nuance to that question. How is it used? What applications are used? Do I have compatibility concerns that would prevent me from taking those users to a Windows 10 instance? So there are all kinds of things that prevent me from maybe making the best use of the solution if I keep my old mindset in place. And that's kind of what we want to address here. So understanding usage, do I have an opportunity to rationalize items? Then there are the practical questions of what does it take for me to actually port that workload over? And this is one of those appropriate settings that, so I'm getting some feedback. Is anyone else having audio problems? Did not seem to be an issue before, but I'm getting 2 reports of it. So if now we are running into that, let me know so that way we can move on. I'll address it for a second. Cool. So we're getting more feedback that it's good. Thank you for that. So we can move it by making sure that we plan our resources appropriately. So the big thing for us is we want to have our cost understood upfront. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Obviously, there might be some variance in the workload, but the big issue is we want to be able to understand some ballpark figure for how much is it going to cost me to move to Windows Virtual Desktop, because you do have to host those session workloads. Sizing that up front is very important because it can have some very, very important ramifications for cost savings, meaning you're not oversizing to try and make sure you don't have performance problems. But it also means that you have another savings, which is user frustration if you're starting to move people from something that they're kind of used to, like a physical desktop in front of them, for example, to something that's hosted elsewhere. The other thing is fundamentally changing how those users work if we think they're a good fit for it. So there's a multi-session solution that is unique to the Windows Virtual Desktop solution set. So you can only get this through an Azure-based solution. But there's a big question: who would I want to have a session on a multi-session instance? How would I move it? What should move? Then finally, there's the additional question of, if I were to want to maybe publish individual applications or things of that sort, should I? So all of these are kind of aspects of understanding what my current state is and then kind of encompassing that into a plan for migration. But at the end of this process, in my opinion, the most important thing of all happens, which is, people actually have to use it to do their job. And that is kind of the end goal, obviously. But it is interesting that the kind of tracking of the performance of those things that people use to be productive can be a bit lacking in some cases. So it's important for us to be able to do a few things. One, engage in a practice generally referred to as digital experience monitoring. So it's kind of a concept of understanding user experience through quantitative metrics like observed performance problems or diagnostic or connection issues or whatever, and qualitative concerns, which is things that users may notice about their experience that they don't necessarily care for. So very big kind of space and complicated, but narrowly for us, what we're interested in is using that practice to understand, have we given our users a good quality of experience? And really, have we gone through and done what we set out to do initially, which is give someone that good quality of experience and really solved the business related problems that I am trying to resolve. So in this case, what I'm going to do is now transition us into an overview of what that content looks like and how we get there. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second, what I'm going to do is now share one of our instances, and we'll go through a little bit of a walkthrough of what this process looks like and what you can expect to see. So right now, we are looking at an instance of our Cloud Edition. So we have an Azure hosted cloud-based solution for data collection. It's free to sign up. It's free for a Windows Virtual Desktop assessment. You'll see that URL at the end, and that will be part of the content that's presented later. So you don't have to memorize it or anything. But the idea is that as a Microsoft partner and as a party that's interested in making sure that people get a lot of utility out of their Windows Virtual Desktop solutions, what we have provided is a no-cost introductory assessment. So you can come to this URL, pretty simple, you register, and what it does is set you up for a data collection exercise and a migration suggestion. So essentially, how can I move my systems from point A to point B with kind of our guidance? So I noticed we have a question on the volume of endpoints. It's a good question. Our FAQ document as kind of the baseline. In general, we do encourage people to try and get as many devices as you can. There is, some variance in terms of, how many devices are a good representative sample. But in general, as many devices as you want usually can be covered as part of the assessment practice. So you asked 100,000 devices. That may change my answer a little bit. So, I was thinking more like in the ballpark of, let's say, 10,000. I'm not that concerned. 100,000, I'm going to say, please call us. And that goes for anybody out there. But yeah, we'll come up with something. At any rate, a little bit of a digression there. But if there are any questions about this, we've got some additional contact and other info items here if you have any questions on the kind of mechanics of the licensing. So for this, though, you sign up and it's pretty simple. You have the ability to distribute a collection client that's been configured for your specific tenant. What that means is you just deploy that MSI, pre-configured, don't have to do anything really, and you automatically start collecting data. Well, what does that look like? In our case, it's a picture of here, we're looking at an internal environment, the current state of play for one of our, and this is a Lakeside internal IT environment. And it tells me a few things. First, though, there are some items in here that are a little bit different in purpose. So for the first part of this, we're going to start in our trending tools, which are things that represent what we've observed over a fair time frame. So here, the last 30 days, we've seen honestly not a great user experience. So 68% as we represent it is a poorer user experience, but we can dig into why and trend it. So here we have latency related issues. Well, I dwell here for the simple point that in an existing environment, if you have existing user experience issues and you do some things like take your existing environment and move it to Azure, it will not start working just because you moved it from one place to another. So initially understanding where there are some problems can be a very important stepping stone to making sure that you have those addressed before you migrate a system. Latency is a great example of that, but we'll actually take a look at a more practical case when we get into the measurement of user experience. But it's one of those items that is really important when you start moving connectivity. So when I start taking an endpoint and I move it to a, let's say like US East 2 data center, let's say for Azure, it has real ramifications for networking between point A and point B that at the very least, I have to think about how I might manage my Azure-based networking rules, or if I want to have, any of the various solutions that they've got for direct connectivity. So that being said, there are a lot of items in here that are fairly relevant to our investigation, user experience, resource consumption, and we have this split out by purpose. In the interest of time and in the interest of making sure we get some interesting things covered, though, the most interesting aspect of this, to me, is this overlap of a persona. So we dynamically calculate a persona as part of our digital experience monitoring platform. So all of these are predefined. There's nothing you have to do. Yes, some of this is configurable. But by default, you come out with these kind of natively represented work styles and roles. So these are based on the Gartner Common definitions. If you would like to customize that to your heart's content, you have the ability to do that. So I see a question on the creation of custom reports. The answer to that is yes, with a little caveat that normally people would do custom dashboards or items of that sort, which would be supported via our dashboard builder. We can take a very brief look at that, but the idea is that you basically have full access to the product set, but what we've tried to do is narrow it down to as a use case that's specifically focused as possible. So to that end, we'll focus a little bit on why this is important. Well, I mentioned before this concept that we want to collect data for a period to do a characterization. And appropriately, we've got a really good question about the minimum duration. Normally, I recommend about 2 weeks of characterizing information in order to define how someone normally goes about their day-to-day life. 30 days is best because like a full cycle kind of gets you a better representative sample of what people are up to. So what I mean by that is this: interactions. So in this case, what we've got is an overall breakout of, for this persona, what are the applications that are critical to them? Why do I highlight this? As I brought up earlier, there's this concept of trying to identify what do people actually use. Well, I won't go too deep on this, but the idea is if you look at the way that people are productive, you can look at their interaction and you can look at what they have in focus to determine those key items that are really important for their day-to-day business. So we can do some compare and contrast. There are 6 applications that these users use practically for most of their day. There are 243 that they use sometimes. And then if we go in and look at kind of the broader state of play, there are 17,000 or 1,700 applications in the environment. Well, that's not unusual at all. But usually there's only a small set that people actually need. And in this case, that's the recommendation for what you would want to take into a Windows Virtual Desktop instance. So there's a lot of overlap. The only reason I dwell on it is because it's really important for identifying use cases, which then let us do some interesting stuff like this, which is identify, based on those use cases, based off of user resource characterization, and that can be on a per user, per group, per persona basis. We can roll that into a forecast for costing. So this is an element that is fairly important to us. It's this kind of concept of knowing what you're getting yourself into. So, a summary of what if analysis. So what if someone has to use under a certain threshold of CPU or memory or, any number of different combos. But this is a more interactive dashboard. So to the question of, can I customize items? Sure, I can go in and I can add stuff if I'm so inclined, or as is most common, people would probably kind of use it as presented, but you have the ability to do some customization on top of this. So the net result of this is an output, which is an overall guide for how can I undertake my transformation. So each one of these kind of has their place within the overall view of where you're at in the process. And the assessment component of it, again, as you'd expect, is kind of the upfront. I would like to take all of my information and make a practical conclusion about whether Windows Virtual Desktop will work for me. And yes, that report is available out of the box. So this is just, quite literally, when you sign up, you get this. And you can also get this in an on-premises kit. So the net output is sizing and a lot of the analysis that we have here. So that's kind of the assessment side of things. Just to kind of recap again, the prospect of what we're doing here is understanding characteristics about the environment. How is it performing? Do I have anything that I need to resolve up front? Or is there any really good use case that I can identify right off the bat? If so, what are characteristics of the, who falls within that kind of group of good candidates? And how can I size and understand what the ramifications of a move like that might be in terms of a dollar cost? And note that this does include things like egress, IP, TCP transmissions and things like that, insofar as it's possible for us to do that. So I see a QA question. Microsoft approved. Yes, absolutely. So this is a co-sponsored offering with Microsoft. So we are gold partners. This is Microsoft co-branded. They do recommend this as their standard assessment offering for Windows Virtual Desktop. So absolutely. Right. So with that, though, we're ready to move into what I think is personally a slightly more interesting space, which is the management of a steady state environment. So in this case, what we're going to do is walk through what success looks like. Obviously, it's complicated to define what that really means because success has a business definition. So if you have successfully moved your users over, they're doing whatever it is they're supposed to do, the dollars all work, and you're not losing money, ideally. So that being said, what does it mean to measure success with quantitative and qualitative digital experience monitoring, this is where we get into what I think is a very interesting space and what I think is probably the most important part of all, because it doesn't just apply to Windows Virtual Desktop, it applies to everything. So one of the central things that we calculate is this idea of a user experience score. So you saw that previously in our maybe not so great internal environment, but the idea there is that we have two different pieces of aggregate information that's interesting. One, how is everything working? Well, that's a quantitative piece of information. It's stuff like resource usage and limitation, infrastructure issues, networking problems, surrounding infrastructure errors, the kinds of mechanical stuff that either happens or it doesn't, or you can observe without having an opinion about, if you know what I mean. So then there's the qualitative aspect of it, and we'll talk about that in detail when we talk about user engagement. But the important part of this is that user experience score tells you a lot about how now compares to before. So one of the biggest things that you can do is prove with some form of quantitative metrics, and qualitative ideally too, but I mean, we know how people are sometimes. But the point is that this helps you prove that you have delivered on what you set out to do in terms of user experience and successfully giving them a functional environment. So we're always calculating this in the background, easy to understand, 0 to 100, grade score, higher it is the better. And we pinpoint those areas that are causing problems. So in an ideal world, what you've got is, whatever the current state of play is for an environment, so could be good, could be bad, but there is some user experience score. You point to that point, you execute a change, and then you have the ability to see what the improvement is after the fact. So an industry standard of user experience that would be excellent, usually about 95% or above, is what we consider to be pretty good. Now, the general case is more complicated than that, because it kind of depends on some factors like what are your expected thresholds for latency and some things like that. But long story short, usually you want to get in the 95% or above. Most people, in terms of user experience, somewhere between about 85 and 90% for some reasons. But that gets into the mechanics. Point of the matter is we normally segment this out into excellent, good, fair, and poor. So you'll see a breakdown. So excellent here is pretty much there's not anything to complain about. Good would be there are some room for complaints. So when I say 95 or above, that's kind of taking a little bit of the high end of good and rolling it into excellent. Anyway, so the prospect of this is that we are measuring a lot of different indicators, and it can measure things like application load times, application connectivity, and network characteristics. You actually have the ability to integrate in some synthetic monitoring as well. There's a whole host of stuff that factors into this, and we'll take a look at the KPIs as parent categories in a bit. The big thing, though, is that it indicates a real thing, which is productivity loss and the kind of the net impact in terms of clock hours that we've seen. So as a practical example of this, and this is an anonymized extract of a starting place for a customer, to give you an example, in their case, most of their environment fell in that poor category, and they were losing about 40,000 hours of productivity per month based off of that, which is, I would call that rough. So in general, what we want to try to do is figure out how can I triangulate all of that across a use case that is a little bit more complicated than your standard one user, one desktop. So to answer the question about personas, it is a Gartner defined kind of customizable definition. You have the ability to do that through our KITS organization. There's a thing on that. But I would say for more detailed questions, like the mechanical bits and pieces of how you do that, that's a pretty good question for like a customer success team, or if you want to contact us afterwards, because we can go through the documentation on how you do that. So for our purposes, though, with Windows Virtual Desktop, what we want to do is try and capture the complete picture. So as you can see, the stack is a little complicated, but it's also a lot more simple than it could be, because it's really made up of three pieces. So there's our client, which is what do I use to get to the remote session. There is the middle tier, which is how does Microsoft connect me to my session and manage all the kind of nasty pieces that sit between point A and point B. And then there is the session hosts. So District has the ability to collect data from the clients, and that's true fairly universally. So for those of you who are familiar with, our kind of standard offerings, that encompasses Windows, Mac OS, Linux. It also includes thin client-based operating systems, and with the recent update to RD Core, that also means that Windows Virtual Desktop will fall into the category of supportable remote client connections for thin clients. So that is something that will be coming shortly, which I think is going to help complete the picture even more. But point of the matter is, most people will be using for the foreseeable future some kind of a more fully featured client, whatever that happens to be. Even if they're not, we can collect data from that. We can collect data via the diagnostic output that you might find as an output of the infrastructure management characteristics from Microsoft. And finally, we have our picture of what's happening within the remote session host. Now, that's a deceptively important thing to understand for a variety of reasons, but we'll get into it and I'll talk about some practical examples here in a second. So what we're going to do is go into an overview of some of the user experience based insight that I just talked about and some of the Windows Virtual Desktop specific items. So what I'll do is pull up our dashboard for that. And we'll go through that side of the offer. So to answer the question, the pre-analysis of kind of the assessment offering in general is kind of identifying those users that are a good fit. And then you can think of this as a validation that they were a good fit after you have moved them. So in our case, as I mentioned, we kind of have two different pieces that are at play. One is a trending analysis, and the other one is more operational. So operational analysis to me, of course, is a really important part of making sure that you've got the ability to understand what's happening in your environment today and how I can address issues that may crop up or may be unique to my new environment. To that end, we come into our other part of the product, which is the operational view. So our operational insights are largely predicated on two concepts. One, that most people really would prefer to know what the problem is rather than have to dig through a lot of details and log files and things to then come to the conclusion that we could have probably told you up front. So that is the purpose of this sensor framework. It basically expands that idea of a user experience score, which again is kind of a representation of quality, and turns it into a live view of operationally known bad conditions. So here, we've got a bunch of memory leaks for some systems. I have the ability to click in. It'll actually tell me who it is, where they are. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to save that for later. Anyway, so this helps us understand what the current state of things is in the environment right now. So this illustrates to us a number of things. One, in an existing environment, how can we maybe patch up a few things that might cause us some knock-on issues? But for my Windows Virtual Desktop, it helps me understand very quickly, is there something that might be specific to that type of user experience that other people don't get? The other thing I have the ability to do is dig in and, let's say that I want to look at, one system in particular. I have the ability to now go in and do some really detailed root cause analysis. So the real heart of this for me is the concept of tracking user experience and understanding why we think someone may be having a poorer time. Well, there are a lot of kind of reasons for that. There are a lot of things that could cause an underlying either perception or real user experience issue. But here we notice something interesting. So in our particular case, we've got a very large difference in one item. In this case, it's latency that had been causing us performance problems. But let's say I'm curious. Well, I honestly am, but let's say I want to see what happened on this day and something changed. Well, I have the ability to click in. What this will do is take me to that point in time. It'll take me to what was causing the issue, and it'll also take me to what was open and connected. Well, this is a pretty interesting point of connection. The print spooler is causing me some issues because I have a very high connectivity latency between point A and point B. In this case, I actually know expressly why this is. It has something to do with cross the pond networking problems. But the issue is pretty clear because here it's highlighted what it is. It's highlighted the specific app that has some impact. But the prospect of what we have the ability to do is not just that for a specific user, but the ability to manage that in the aggregate and display some pretty useful and meaningful information about how to resolve problems for users. So the practical bits and pieces of what you can do within our tool set, there's a lot. Again, in the interest of time, I won't focus on that so much because we have some stuff that goes into root cause analytics for various items. Instead, what I'll talk about is some of the items that will help add value to a Windows Virtual Desktop instance and hopefully illustrate some of what I mean when I say that it's useful to know what's happening in a guest system. So we also have an integration that allows us to forward data to Azure Log Analytics. Some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not be. Azure Log Analytics is probably best thought of as a kind of semi-unstructured data aggregation and analysis platform. Sounds complicated, it's not. It's basically just the ability for us to send a payload of data into an Azure hosted repository that lets us commingle that data with the diagnostic information from Microsoft. The net result of that is some interesting stuff that you simply cannot do if you don't have something observing what's happening in the guest, like totaling up the resource usage at any particular point in time for every application that's running and telling you, as an example, what might be driving high I/O or network bandwidth in the aggregate. So that to me is a very important and differentiating factor. So, here, for example, I have the ability to do kind of a fresh query to get this stuff live. But this is all off of an actual Windows Virtual Desktop instance that we have forwarding that data in. So the idea is, again, as a classic example, usually your devices don't just wake up one day and decide that they are tired of working. Something happens, like resources are taken that shouldn't be, or an application is faulting or hanging. This can be a useful way of identifying, well, here are some interesting things that tell me in the aggregate, meaning in total, this could be a specific issue. So if I notice I have a very expensive egress bandwidth cost, it will be interesting for me to understand in total, what are the applications that are driving that? Or if I have high I/O, it would be interesting for me to understand something similar. So the entire purpose of what I hope we've walked through and made clear today is that understanding, quantifying, and being able to really articulate what's in an environment, the pieces of how it works, known issues, and all of these things that factor into what makes up a user experience for a user is really critical to make sure they have a great experience. That in turn is really important to making sure that you have a great experience in terms of not spending a lot of money trying to figure out why something is running slow, or trying to randomly resize VMs in the hopes that maybe it solves this user's problems, or giving up on a project because you think that it's not capable of doing what you maybe have a thought that it should do, but in reality, the users want to use it in a different way, or any number of different things. So the overall kind of purpose of this is to set us up for success in a migration to Windows Virtual Desktop. And again, the big thing for me is that success has some different flavors for some different people, but in general, the shared characteristics are you have the ability to understand and articulate how and what you want to move. You have the ability to very quickly and cleanly understand how you can do that efficiently. And then you have the ability to understand if something happens to not be doing what you think it should, how to resolve that and dig in quickly without having to expend a lot of time and effort to do so. And as a natural extension of a project that you've already undertaken. So that is effectively the majority of the content we wanted to go through, which leaves us, of course, with where do we go from here? In this case, Windows Virtual Desktop assessment offerings are available at wvd.lakesidesoftware.com. There are some other resources available to you out there as well, but I'd encourage you to check out the site to get some details. So in this case, the question out there is, can we cover both the client, meaning the endpoint accessing a Windows Virtual Desktop instance, and the remote session host? And the answer is yes. So you would cover both. So you would have an agent in the accessing client, which would be either a Windows device or a Mac OS device or a Linux device, whatever it is. So you'd have an agent or a collection module in that. And then you would also have an agent running in the Windows Virtual Desktop VM. With that, that is the content. I'll leave this up, but we'll also make sure to send around the URL for signups. But thanks a lot for your time. Appreciate it. And hopefully this has been an interesting walkthrough of how you can make use of Lakeside Software and Systrack to understand and deliver on a good, positive migration to Windows Virtual Desktop. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben, for that awesome presentation. I don't know if you just want to share that last slide so we can talk about an upcoming webinar that we have that I think folks on this one might be interested in.
Absolutely.
As well as I see we have a few more questions rolling in, so please feel free if you do have questions, we can hang out for a few minutes here to get those answered. But really quickly, I just want to let everyone know about an exciting upcoming webinar we have with Microsoft Global Black Belt and WVD expert, Christian Brinkoff. So that will be mid-September, and we'll make sure to send that invite along with the recording for this webinar. So hopefully you'll be able to attend that one as well. We'll be covering what's new with Windows Virtual Desktop. Christian is going to walk us through all of the updates, and then we'll cover some WVD best practices as well. I see a question here for you, Ben. Is Systrack for WVD licensed separately?
Yeah, good question. At this point, basically, there is just one base license for Systrack. So the answer to that is not really. There is a different licensing model potentially for a multi-session host versus a single session, but you get the same functionality, on premises for multi-session as you would in Windows Virtual Desktop. So it's just a question of kind of the monthly SaaS cost.
And I see another good question here. Can we get some benefits for Azure Migrate benefits?
Yeah, so Azure Migrate is an interesting integration point for us because it allows us to output what we think the sizing should be and allows us to identify users that potentially could be a fit for a multi-session environment. So the utility there is having a unified point of representation of that data with other migration projects. So if you're also, for example, migrating some server resources, or if you're taking the opportunity to explore maybe some Azure cloud resources as an alternative to how you have undertaken maybe the traditional IT approach at whatever environment you've got. If you were to undertake something like that, then you would be able to see our information about end user details commingled with the server details, which I think would be interesting. There's also going to be some work done in that area to expand on some automation. Won't go into too much detail on that, but there is an interest in maybe taking some of our findings and trying to automate some template creation and things of that sort. So the answer to your question, sorry, skipping a step. So app attach, so asking about MSIX, performance associated with that, the answer is kind of. It gets complicated because I think part of that actually is going to make use of some of the right filter drivers that would redirect some of the characteristics the operating system would observe about the performance. So the short answer is yes, we would see some details, but we would not necessarily see all of them. That's a slightly complicated topic, but if you know what you're looking for, yes, absolutely, you would be able to differentiate between that and a standard app. Cool. Any other questions? All right.
I see one more, Ben, if you want to hang on for one more. Is it compatible for co-management?
Uh, Um, I'm going to make an assumption about what you mean by that, which is that if we also have another management plane in place, meaning like a Citrix cloud, would that also function? If that's not what you mean, please correct me. The answer to that is yes. So we would be able to be compatible with co-management. So that would apply in the case that you had, let's say, a VMware Horizon implementation or Citrix solution based on top of Windows Virtual Desktop. That actually just adds to some data that we can collect because there's some protocol and solution specific stuff that comes from that kind of an implementation. So definitely a handled case for us. Cool. So I see another question, the ability for us to have solutions for service-based solutions like Amazon Workspace. So AWS is an interesting case. The answer is yes, that would be something that we would have the ability to do. That has had less interest to date, but I think we may be able to pick that back up. So the answer is certainly the solution set is not necessarily isolated to Azure-based solutions because a lot of the concepts would overlap, but there are some differences in the underlying technologies that we would make recommendations for AWS versus Azure.
All right. Well, I think we can give everyone a few minutes of their time back, but thanks so much, Ben, for that great presentation.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.